For years, Tom Jones didn't just perform, he dominated every stage he stepped onto. His presence felt untouchable, almost immune to time, pressure, or failure. Audiences didn't simply attend his shows, they arrived expecting certainty. The voice would deliver, the charisma would land, the performance would overwhelm. That reliability became his identity. But what looked like control from the outside was slowly becoming something else behind the scenes. What once felt like momentum was turning into repetition and repetition into pressure. By the time he reached the peak of his Las Vegas years, success wasn't something he enjoyed anymore, it was something he had to maintain, no matter the cost. Las Vegas, in particular, played a major role in shaping that pressure. It wasn't just another stop on a tour, it was a system, a machine that demanded consistency above all else. Night after night, the same expectations followed him onto the stage. The audience didn't come for surprises, they came for a familiar experience delivered flawlessly. Over time, that environment stopped rewarding creativity and started punishing it. Any attempt to shift direction, even slightly, risked breaking the formula that had made him successful. And so, without fully realizing it, Tom Jones became part of that system, less an artist exploring his craft and more a figure maintaining a brand. At the same time, his personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. Fame had opened doors, but it had also blurred boundaries. Stories about his lifestyle began circulating more openly, moving beyond private whispers into public conversation. The image that once felt exciting and rebellious slowly started to shift. For some, it became excessive. For others, it became distracting. The gap between who he was on stage and who he was off stage grew wider, and eventually, that gap became impossible to ignore. What made the situation more difficult was that none of this showed up clearly in headlines at first. From the outside, everything still looked successful. The shows were selling out, the money was flowing, the name still carried weight, but internally something had changed. The connection between performer and audience, once effortless, was becoming fragile. And in a place like Las Vegas, where audiences are quick to react and slow to forgive, that kind of shift doesn't stay hidden for long. The night everything changed didn't begin dramatically. It started like so many others before it. The lights came up, the crowd settled in, and Tom stepped onto a stage he believed he understood completely. There were no obvious warning signs, no clear indication that this performance would be different. But as the show unfolded, something subtle began to shift in the room. It wasn't loud at first. It was quieter than that: restlessness, movement, a lack of attention that slowly spread through the audience. When he introduced a new song, the reaction was immediate and not in the way he expected. Instead of leaning in, the crowd pulled back. The energy dropped, murmurs replaced anticipation. Within moments, that uncertainty turned into something sharper. A few voices spoke out, then more followed. What started as isolated reactions quickly grew into something unified. The audience wasn't just disengaged, they were rejecting what they were hearing in real time. Tom responded the way he always had, by pushing forward. He continued singing, relying on experience and control to bring the room back. For years, that approach had worked. But this time it didn't. The resistance didn't fade, it grew stronger. The noise became impossible to ignore. What had once been admiration had shifted into judgment, and that judgment was being expressed openly, without hesitation. As the moment escalated, the performance began to collapse. It wasn't about a missed note or a technical issue. It was something deeper than that. The audience had decided collectively that they were no longer willing to follow him in that moment. And once that decision is made in a live setting, it's almost impossible to reverse. The connection breaks, and everything that depends on it begins to fall apart. What made the situation even more intense was the crowd's reaction to the breakdown itself. Instead of pulling back, they leaned into it. The energy shifted from disappointment to something closer to confrontation. The performance was no longer the focus, the reaction was, and in that environment, control slips quickly. What had started as a routine show turned into a public unraveling in a matter of minutes. Security eventually stepped in, not to protect the performance but to end it. That detail matters. It wasn't about giving him time to recover or regroup. It was about removing him from a situation that had already gone too far. The exit wasn't planned or graceful. It happened in the middle of the moment, with the audience still reacting behind him. And in that instant, something significant changed, not just in the room, but in how he would be seen moving forward. Backstage, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. This wasn't just a difficult show. It was something more defining. For an artist who had built his career on control and consistency, being publicly rejected in that way carries a different kind of weight. It forces a level of reflection that success often delays. And for the first time in a long time, there was no immediate solution, no quick way to move past it. In the weeks that followed, silence replaced visibility. Appearances stopped, performances were canceled quietly. There were no major statements or public explanations. From the outside, it looked like a pause, but internally it was something closer to a reset. The distance from the stage created space for reflection, and that reflection wasn't easy. Without the constant movement of touring and performing, there was time to confront questions that had been avoided for years. The Vegas incident in many ways became a focal point. not because it was the only problem, but because it exposed everything else. It brought underlying issues to the surface: creative limitations, personal struggles, and a growing disconnect with audiences. What had once been manageable in isolation now felt interconnected, and understanding that connection became the first step toward any kind of recovery. At home, the stillness made things even clearer. Without the distractions of performance and travel, personal tensions became harder to ignore. Relationships that had been strained by years of distance and lifestyle choices now required attention. And unlike the stage where control could be maintained through performance, real life didn't offer the same protection. It required honesty, patience, and change, none of which come easily in the aftermath of public failure. Over time, the idea of returning to the stage began to shift. It was no longer about proving something to the audience. It became more about understanding what kind of artist he wanted to be moving forward. That distinction matters because it changes the motivation behind the performance. Instead of chasing the past, the focus turns toward building something more sustainable. The road back wasn't immediate and it wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden comebacks or headline-grabbing moments. It was slower than that, more deliberate. Each decision carried more weight because the cost of getting it wrong had already been experienced, and that awareness shaped everything that came next. In the months that followed his disappearance from the stage, the silence around Tom Jones became almost as noticeable as his performances once were. In the entertainment world, absence is rarely neutral. When someone so visible suddenly steps back without explanation, people begin to fill the gaps with their own interpretations. Some assumed it was temporary exhaustion. Others believed it signaled something more permanent. But behind that silence, something far more complex was unfolding, something that couldn't be resolved with a quick return or a carefully managed public appearance. For the first time in years, he was no longer moving at the pace that fame had demanded. There were no back-to-back shows, no constant travel, no immediate need to perform. At first, that stillness felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. His identity had been built around momentum, around always being in motion. Without that structure, the days stretched differently. Time slowed down, and with that came a level of awareness that had long been postponed. One of the most difficult aspects of that period was confronting the gap between public perception and private reality. For years, the image had been carefully maintained: confidence, charm, control. But without the stage to reinforce that image, it became harder to sustain internally. The confidence that once felt automatic now required effort. And in quieter moments, doubt began to take its place. Not just doubt about the future, but doubt about the foundation he had been standing on for so long. The Las Vegas incident wasn't something he could simply dismiss as a bad night. It lingered, not just as a memory but as a question. What exactly had gone wrong? Was it the audience, the material, or had something shifted within him that he hadn't fully recognized at the time? These weren't easy questions, and more importantly, they didn't have simple answers, but avoiding them was no longer an option. At the same time, the pressures that had been building in his personal life became impossible to ignore. Fame often creates distance in relationships, and over time, that distance can turn into disconnection. In his case, years of touring and a lifestyle shaped by constant attention had created strains that couldn't be smoothed over anymore. What had once been tolerated or overlooked now demanded acknowledgement. His relationship with Linda Jones had endured years of imbalance. She had remained largely out of the spotlight while his life unfolded in public view. That contrast had allowed certain issues to stay unspoken for longer than they should have. But in the absence of distraction, those issues came into focus. Conversations that had been delayed began to happen, and they weren't easy. There's a difference between knowing something is wrong and actually facing it. During this period, that difference became clear. It wasn't just about individual mistakes or isolated decisions. It was about patterns, ways of living that had developed over time and gone unchallenged because success had made them easier to ignore. Now, without that buffer, the consequences felt more immediate. What made this stage particularly difficult was that there was no clear roadmap forward. In his career, he had always relied on instinct, on experience, on knowing how to read a room. But this was different. There was no audience to respond to, no feedback in real time. The process of reflection is quieter, slower, and often less certain. It requires patience and, more importantly, honesty. Gradually, the focus began to shift from external validation to internal understanding. Instead of asking how to win back audiences, the question became more personal: what needed to change in order to move forward at all? That shift may seem subtle, but it's significant. It marks the difference between reacting to a setback and learning from it. Part of that learning involved reassessing his relationship with fame itself. For years, it had been a source of energy and opportunity, but it had also created expectations that were difficult to sustain indefinitely. The idea of always being on, always delivering at the same level, had come at a cost. And recognizing that cost was an important step toward redefining what success would look like in the future. There was also a growing awareness that audiences had changed. The connection that once felt automatic now required something different. Authenticity, in particular, had become more important. People weren't just responding to performance, they were responding to sincerity. And that meant the approach moving forward couldn't simply be a return to what had worked before. Rebuilding, in this context, wasn't about reclaiming a previous image. It was about creating something more grounded. That process doesn't happen quickly and it doesn't happen all at once. It's made up of smaller decisions: what to accept, what to avoid, what to prioritize, and over time, those decisions begin to shape a new direction. Music, interestingly, remained a constant throughout this period. Even without public performances, it continued to serve as a point of connection, not in the same way as before, but in a more personal sense. It became less about delivering to an audience and more about understanding what he wanted to express moving forward. As weeks turned into months, the idea of returning to the stage began to feel less overwhelming, not because everything had been resolved, but because there was a clearer sense of purpose behind it. The goal was no longer to prove invincibility, it was to engage honestly, both with the audience and with himself. That distinction would ultimately define the next phase of his career, because when he did return, it wouldn't be as the same performer trying to recreate past dominance. It would be as someone who had experienced a very public setback and taken the time to understand it. And in many ways, that made the return more meaningful. The process of rebuilding trust, both personally and professionally, takes time. It can't be rushed and it can't be forced, but it can be approached with intention, and that's what began to take shape during this period: a quieter, more deliberate approach to both life and work. By the end of those 6 months, the situation hadn't been fully resolved, but it had been reframed. What once felt like an ending began to look more like a turning point. Not an easy one and not one without consequences, but a moment that created the possibility for something different. And sometimes that's what a setback does. It interrupts the path you're on, not to stop you completely, but to force a change in direction. For Tom Jones, that change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun. When Tom Jones finally began stepping back into the public eye, the return didn't resemble the past. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic attempts to reclaim dominance overnight. Instead, it was quieter, more controlled, and noticeably more intentional. The man who had once relied on sheer presence to command a room now approached performance with a different kind of awareness. It wasn't about overpowering the audience anymore. It was about reconnecting with them. That shift didn't happen automatically. It came from everything he had processed during those months away. The silence, the reflection, the discomfort, all of it had forced him to slow down in a way he never had before. And that slower pace began to shape how he worked. He chose smaller settings, more focused performances, and material that allowed space instead of demanding constant intensity. For the first time in years, restraint became part of his identity as a performer. Audiences, in turn, responded differently. The expectation of perfection had softened. What replaced it was something more nuanced, a curiosity about who he was now, not just who he had been. And that curiosity gave him room to evolve. Instead of repeating the same formula, he could explore different tones, different emotional ranges, different ways of connecting through music. It wasn't about abandoning his legacy, it was about expanding it. One of the most significant changes was how he handled vulnerability. Earlier in his career, vulnerability had often been masked by confidence. The performance itself acted as a shield, keeping deeper emotions at a distance. But now that approach felt incomplete. The experiences he had gone through, both publicly and privately, had added layers that couldn't simply be hidden behind charisma, and rather than resisting that, he began to incorporate it. Offstage, the process of rebuilding continued just as steadily. Relationships don't repair themselves quickly, especially after years of strain, but consistency over time began to make a difference. Showing up, staying present, and making different choices gradually created a new foundation. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that reality mattered more than maintaining an image. His relationship with Linda Jones in particular became a central part of that rebuilding. What had once been overshadowed by distance and distraction now required attention and effort. The dynamic had changed. There was less illusion, less avoidance, and more honesty. That kind of shift doesn't erase the past, but it does create the possibility for something more stable moving forward. Professionally, the industry itself was also changing. New artists were emerging, audiences were evolving, and the definition of relevance was shifting. Instead of competing directly with those changes, he adapted to them. He leaned into experience rather than trying to outpace youth. That decision allowed him to find a different kind of space, one built on longevity rather than constant reinvention for the sake of survival. Over time, that approach began to pay off. The narrative around him started to change. The Las Vegas incident, once seen as a defining failure, gradually became part of a larger story, one that included setback, reflection, and growth. It didn't disappear, but it lost its power to define everything that followed. Instead, it became a reference point, a reminder of how quickly things can shift and how important it is to adapt. As the years passed, his performances carried a different energy. There was still strength, still control, but it was balanced by something deeper. Experience has a way of shaping expression, and in his case, it added weight to everything he did. Songs weren't just delivered, they were lived in, and audiences could sense that difference even if they couldn't always articulate it. Another important change was how he viewed success itself. Earlier, success had been tied closely to dominance, being the best, the loudest, the most unforgettable presence in the room. But after everything he had experienced, that definition no longer held the same value. Success became more about sustainability, about continuing to perform without losing himself in the process. That perspective also influenced how he interacted with younger performers. Having experienced both the highs and the consequences of fame, he understood something that isn't always obvious early in a career. Talent can open doors, but it doesn't protect you from pressure, expectation, or personal choices, and sharing that understanding became part of his role in the industry. There's a particular kind of credibility that comes from having faced public failure and continued forward anyway. It's different from the credibility of constant success. It carries more depth, more realism. And for many artists, that kind of perspective is more valuable in the long run. It reflects not just what someone can achieve, but what they can endure. Looking back, the night in Las Vegas didn't end his career, but it did change its direction. It forced a pause at a moment when everything had been moving too quickly to question. And in that pause, he found the opportunity to rebuild, not just as a performer, but as a person navigating the realities behind the spotlight. The idea that fame can become a trap isn't unique, but it often goes unrecognized until something disrupts it. In his case, that disruption was public and immediate, but the conditions leading up to it had been forming for years, and understanding that made all the difference in what came next. By the time he reached later stages of his career, there was a sense of balance that hadn't existed before. The performance was still there, the voice still carried, but the approach had matured. It was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about maintaining a connection to the music, to the audience, and to himself. Even after personal losses later in life, including the passing of Linda Jones, that sense of balance remained important. Grief, like pressure, can either overwhelm or reshape you, and in his case it became something that deepened his work rather than ending it. The lessons learned earlier, the need for control, for awareness, for restraint, continued to guide him. What ultimately defines a long career isn't the absence of failure, it's the ability to respond to it, to adjust, to learn, and to keep moving forward with a clearer understanding of what matters, and that's what his journey reflects. Not a perfect rise, but a sustained effort to adapt over time. The story, then, isn't just about one night or one moment. It's about everything that surrounded it, the build-up, the collapse, and the gradual reconstruction that followed. It's about how success can create pressure, how pressure can lead to mistakes, and how those mistakes can either end a path or redirect it. And in the end, the question is whether the crowd was right or wrong on that night. It's what that moment revealed and what was done with that revelation afterward. Because for Tom Jones, the real story wasn't the fall. It was the decision to rebuild differently and more deliberately than before.